Hi, this is Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute. This video is about the program, the whole thing, and I know it's quite a bit to get your arms around when you're looking at this project, but this is all the constituent parts and what their purpose is. So let's get started, and hopefully at the end you'll have some idea what we're up to here. So part of understanding the program requires ending the confusion between science, logic, law, and philosophy. So logic is the test of constant relations. Your brain does it. It's necessary for your brain to organize the world. It's necessary for, once that world is built, to remember locations and find your way between them, or to find objects and find them. Nesting behavior is necessary. So you need some sort of this logical facility to organize the world into constant relations, inconstant relations, and contingent relations. Science is a method of discovering what we can testify to, producing testimony about something. We generally think of it as producing testimony by the process of discovery of different subjects, in which we're looking for their first principles, in other words, what their causal relations are, first causal relations are. And then once we've discovered those first principles, we can apply logic to explain everything that emerges within that domain, or within that science. So we use science as a process of discovery in which we try to develop testimony, eventually testimony about the first principles in a discipline, from which we can construct a logic to describe the behavior of that system or science. Law is what we use to decide conflicts. Now, that means conflicts over true and false, reciprocal and irreciprocal, whatever criteria we have. But we have to get to the point where there's a conflict in order to try to resolve it. The conflict has to be meaningful for us to try to resolve it. And philosophy is what assists us in making choices. In other words, a philosophy is a means of creating a paradigm that assists us in making decisions or choices in pursuit of some ends. So you can have the philosophy of something. This is a science. In other words, what we are doing in P-Law is developing a science that allows us to produce the logic of first causes, which allows us to apply law to the resolution of disputes, differences, or disagreements about what's true or false, good or bad, and criminal or not. Philosophy helps us to make choices. In other words, positive choices. The law assists us. Science and law allow us to make decisions, in other words, decidable decisions, and philosophy lets us make judgments. It's unfortunately that the word judge is judgments associated with law, and decidability is what we're doing in law. But when we're making a judgment, that's an internal, resorting to internal preference. When we're making a decision, like when we're finding something is decidable, 3 is larger than 2. That's decidable by definition. Whether we prefer chocolate pudding or cheesecake for dessert is a judgment of preference or good. So that's the disambiguation between those disciplines. There is a desperate attempt by philosophy that has failed us for the past century, and they have desperately to try to say that philosophy is but it's really not. It's science has demarcated the difference between philosophy, in other words, what is true with science and law, and what is judgmental, which is philosophy. That's complete. Philosophers want to argue with me. That's okay. We'll prove it in this. We'll prove it as we go through the method here that philosophy and science are fully demarcated. But that's okay, because the history of reason has been developing what we call natural philosophy, which was evolved into the sciences, leaving those things that are not questions of truth, but questions of preference to philosophy, because science and law can't tell you what's preferential. They can tell you they can tell you what might not end up in a good thing or might be harmful to you, but when anything that's not false or irreciprocal is therefore either amoral or moral or good. So the market, in other words, the market for human beings, we don't have to agree on what the good is. We can group together to discover many goods at once. But the truth is that differences are always decidable. In other words, conflicts are always decidable. People can try to argue with me with that, but you have to go. We'll find out over time that that's not the case. So we can refer to P-law, in other words, the completed science of decidability of plea law as the completion of the scientific method. And this, as we'll find out, the scientific method, the search for it via positiva failed. However, we see that via negativa we've decided we can in fact produce a scientific method. We can also refer to P-law as the science of decidability across all subject matters and domains. We can describe it as the science of truth, testimony, reciprocity, and cooperation as the application of decidability across all domains. So we complete the scientific method. The scientific method produces decidability across all, excuse me, my asthma is bothering me a bit. The scientific method helps us produce decidability across all domains. Then across all domains, we have the science of law, which consists of truth, testimony, reciprocity, and cooperation as the application of that decidability across all domains, and the science of cooperation that results from what's left in that law. That's a 4-step analytical response to, well, but everybody wants something that tells them what to do. They want to force other people to agree with them. So they want an ideology or a philosophy or a theology or something that forces people to work together, when we don't actually want that. We want a market where groups of people who pursue different means to pursue different ends, because the most trial and error produces the most opportunity for someone to discover something that's beneficial for all. So there's no difference between these 4 statements. They're just the hierarchy of what we've accomplished here. The completion of the scientific method, producing the science of decidability, the science of law, truth, law, which is the broadest scope of decidability. In other words, anything that needs to be decided by truth through reciprocity can be decided by law. Anything that can't be decided by truth or reciprocity, or non-falsehood and irreciprocity, is matter of philosophy. It's a matter of choice. And so what results is the science of cooperation that limits us to what things are cooperative rather than parasitic, predatory, or false. So what is the science of cooperation then? It's the positive, what's the positive utility of resolving differences between humans? Well, there's only value of decidability is to produce cooperation by reducing the friction, error, and deceit that's necessarily involved when people have different knowledge, understanding, resources, and interests. So the only reason we really need to know what's true, moral, or survivable is to resolve disputes, resolve differences in knowledge, and produce as many reciprocally rewarding compromises with each other as possible. Because cooperation is the equal sign by which people with different sensory systems and knowledge, etc., discover something about the state of the world and cooperate together in order to make something beneficial happen at a cheaper price than if they tried to do it on their lonesome. So the program is a set of ideas. It's not just one thing. It's a set of ideas, a big set of ideas. It's sort of like a reformation that consists of the completion of the scientific method, and producing the science of decidability and testimony. Then we apply it to the totality of human knowledge across all disciplines, creating a first principles logic of every discipline with which we can use disciplines to compete each other for coherence, which makes us further falsify them, leaving only true statements about those disciplines and interdisciplinary statements possible. And that produces a universally commensurable language, which is a paradigm, which is this most parsimonious paradigm I'm talking about, the first principles paradigm, a vocabulary of that first principles paradigm, a logic of that first principles paradigm, and a grammar with which to express it. Now, grammar means rules of continuous recursive disambiguation, which is what the universe does, what your brain does, what language does, and what a person hearing you does. Continuous recursive disambiguation. We eliminate the ambiguous by increasing the amount of information. In philosophy, they tend to call this providing empirical content. But we're going to be more, we're just disambiguating. Then we take that universal language and we put it into the law. I don't mean we legislate. We make the primary natural law out of this system so that it's an unambiguous system of law. And then we take that and we've got a scientific and logical constitution. In other words, we break a constitution of what we call natural law. You'd be surprised at how good our founders' constitution would be. I'd be surprised at the history of the common law. And we're going to explain why the history of the common law is so surprising. And we'll understand when we make through that why European civilization evolved faster than the rest in every great era, because it is by accident of malice, the most correspondent with the laws of the universe. So once we produce this scientific law and constitution, this allows us to criminalize, in other words, get away from free speech, but to criminalize irreciprocal and untestifiable display, word, and deed. In other words, we can prevent politicians, the academy, and the media from lying because we can criminalize what's false and irreciprocal, because we can measure what's false and irreciprocal. We can end the industrialization of lying that's occurred during the 19th and 20th centuries, and now into the 21st, where it's threatening us with a new dark age. And as a consequence, we can eradicate all these things, the superstition, pseudoscience, sophistry, fraud, deceit, false promises, and propaganda. We can eliminate that from the commercial, financial, economic, political, and informational commons and end this problem where all of the public people in a democracy are suffering from saturation with lies, and they don't have the time, energy, effort, or education, or willpower to go through and try to sift through the literal the tide of lies that it washes over them every day. The result is we produce a suit against the state, which is what the founders did with their Declaration of Independence. We produce a common law suit against the state for restitution, reformation, repairing our Constitution, restoring natural law, restoring truth in the commons, restoring good government, restoring honest finance, and if necessary, restitution and punishment. I like the punishment part because I think there's a lot of people who want restitution and punishment for all that's been done to our people over time. So here are the constituent parts of the program. Is the methodology. We call that the method. That method is the method of producing decidability. The logic that results is the paradigm, grammar, logic, and vocabulary. We call that a value neutral. In other words, it's value independent. It's universally measurable, universally commensurable. I mean, everything in all disciplines are commensurable with each other. Operational grammar, which means that it's described as subjectively testable human actions. In other words, we describe things as as a series of steps that human beings can make. And of an operational grammar, a vocabulary, and a logical language. This language allows us to testify, meaning speak truthfully with warranty and liability about decidability across all disciplines. Again, that's the P logic, the hierarchy of P logic, and what we call the grammars. The grammars would be like what you think about as you think about the way that they talk in a discipline, like the logic and vocabulary of physics, or the logic and vocabulary of chemistry, the logic and vocabulary of social science. We would call that a grammar because it's the rules of continuous recursive disambiguation within that paradigm, within the limits of that paradigm, using the first principles of that paradigm. We take that and then we complete the scientific method with it, and we produce the what we call testimonialism or testimonial truth, and conversely we end the deceits. And as much of this program is devoted to educating us about deceits, the means by which deceits are constructed, frauds, deceits, and of all kinds, as testimony and truth. They're a balanced scale, and this is the most complete work on deceit you'll have found. It's also the most complete work on truth, but it's the most complete work on deceit you'll have found, and probably the most complete work on irreciprocity, meaning crime, criminal, unethical, immoral, and war behaviors. We call that the P law, the resulting decidability as P law. We take the application of the method and P law to the sciences, and we reform basically every discipline. This is why this program is so big, is because we have to touch at least the first principles of most disciplines. In this course, we don't go into all of them. This course tends to limit itself to the social sciences, because dealing with the physical sciences, the math, it's really fascinating if you're into the philosophy of science, but it's beyond the scope of what we're trying to accomplish here, which is law. I mean, reforming how they talk about mathematics or physics, which is the two places where most or logic, the three places where there are many problems, is minor compared to the rather severe difference in language, metaphysics, language, cognitive science, sociology, psychology, sociology, and group evolutionary strategy, as well as politics and economics. That's where our disputes are, so we focus most of our energy there. We call this applied P. This is the application of P method and P law to the disciplines, producing this, thereby falsifying and reforming them. And then we use the P method, P logic, and P law, and applied P, and we produce the explanation for Western success in the ancient and modern worlds by adaptive velocity. The Western civilization adapted faster because of our initial institutions, and we'll cover what happens to every original civilization depending on its first choices. And we call that discussion that explains Western civilization the Western group evolutionary strategy. We also cover the other civilizations too, the major ones anyway. Can't go to all of them in history because it takes quite a bit of knowledge to work through diagnosing what that is, and it's hard to go back in time. And I mean, like, for example, I understand the East Russian civilization's culture very well because I worked hard at understanding it and living there. But the one I want to study is actually Germany. I don't know why I can't get there, but I need to go to Germany and live for about a year so I can put the concept of Ordnung into some analytic prose that can be written into law itself. But anyway, we're going to cover all these group evolution, the civilizational strategies of the different groups. After that, we're going to produce an explanation of the different systems of argument. We call this the grammars. Particularly, we're going to spend time on the methods of deceit that came out of the old world that started with us today. We call that the grammars, and we're going to work on falsifying, deflationary, testimonial. We're going to work on getting rid of those. Getting rid of the means by which lies are conducted in those means. Next, we produce a constitution, a body of law, and intended policies. Now, really, everybody wants to know about the method that I've worked on here, and everybody wants to understand my research program. But my opinion is all that matters is the output. The output is a strict statement, a formal logic of law, natural law, a formal constitution of natural law, producing a scientific basis for law, constitution, and government, the institutions of government that are also equally scientific, and the policies and economies and economics that would allow us to get over the current crisis that is driving everyone rather crazy. So we call these the reforms, and they're some of this is online already. The high-level stuff is online. That's the set of. Then we put together the policies. The policies are up there. Most people say I should talk about the policies more, but I'm sort of build the castle from the foundations upward, and I will get to enumerating those policies a little more detail. But basically, the major ones are up there. They're the ones that the policies would restore the middle class and end the great system of parasitism on our people, and it would solve the problem of both center left and center right. It would not make extremes happy in any group. And it would provide a set of restitutions and punishments that serve to return the wealth to the American people and punish those who've engaged in undermining our people, and in future prevent future undermining of our people in the future. And we call these the restitutions. So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as a bottom, from the very bottom of creating a science all the way to scientific government, to producing scientific policies, to use the science to reform and restore harmony, at least in Western civilization, because it's possible for us to do it. So that's the program. Now, because a lot of people are, in the absence of science, there has been a tendency to use philosophy as a weak substitute for science. So we have a lot of people that try to follow philosophy, and until there's a science like we've produced here for solving the more complex problems of the world. So in essence, I'd like to put this up here to just show that we've merged the philosophy and science into a single hierarchy, and we've put it all here. And these are the equivalents in P-Law that are in the standard sciences, philosophy and sciences. So we have metaphysics, call it Vitruvianism, which is that man is the measure of all things to man. We have a linguistics program, which we call the grammars. Our epistemology is adversarialism, and those are the sort of verbal side of things. We have physics, psychology, and sociology. Psychology we have based on its first principle, which is acquisition. Sociology based on its first principle, which is called compatibilism. In other words, the sexes are compatible, classes are compatible, groups are compatible until they're not. We call ethics and morality cooperationism. In economics, it's the cooperative returns on time. Time is the first principle of economics. In law, we call it algorithmic natural law. The reason being, I'm trying to demarcate what we do today as natural law, really in harmony with nature, adherence to the laws of the universe. So we've produced a scientific law, which is in concordance with the laws of the universe. And I've disambiguated the long history of natural law back to Aristotle by putting algorithmic in front of it so that we know that it's this strictly constructed formal logic of natural law. In politics, we deal with rule of law or its absence. It's really, you either have rule of law by natural law, or you have rule of something else, usually corruption or despotism or some kind of oligarchy. That leaves the questions that aren't questions of falsehood, which is the strategy of group civilizations, spirituality, which I'm going to separate from religion, natural religion, which is, I don't want to go into here, and natural religion is what is a non-false religion. And so one of the hardest problem I worked on was religion, and it's possible to have a non-false religion. The Greeks pretty much got there. Unfortunately, the Greeks overexpanded and the Romans overexpanded, and they encountered conditions under which they could be defeated by religion. And lastly, aesthetics, how we address aesthetics. So we sort of merge philosophy and the sciences into one coherent system that's commensurable across it. If you're a philosophy nerd, if you're really into this stuff, I'd say you should read the Encyclopedia of Philosophy entries on operationalism, the emergence of first-order logic, constructive mathematics, and intuitionism. To some degree, the intuitionistic program is what it failed us, or it failed to compete because it was being applied to the least important subjects, and it wasn't applied to the most important subjects, which gave us the opportunity for the pseudoscience of the 20th century. So if you look at Brigman in physics, or Hilbert in mathematics and physics, or Brewer in math, Mises in praxeology, which is he's really trying to produce a theory of incentives, but he ends up with a pseudoscience. Turing gets there, Chomsky gets there, and various people got there in neurology. In simple terms, we have to be able to construct a claim of the possibility of existence from a sequence of operations which is dependent upon construction from, consistency with, and continuity with first principles. So like in math, axioms are declared, they're variable, you can make them up, and we seek to prove deducibility of a claim from declared, presumptive, or arbitrary premises. In other words, we declare the premises and then we create axioms to work from them. However, in science, we're discovering laws that are invariant, and we seek to prove construction from them. So in other words, what we're doing is we're producing a computable logic. And in this sense, that's what I'm trying to get to, is that the failure started in 1830 with Babbage's discovery of computation, but his failure to, or the world's failure to turn into a general theory. It hit Darwin. Darwin ran into the problem of not understanding computation, so he couldn't solve the riddle of genetics. And after that, all sorts of bad things start happening, even though because people are stuck in mathematical Platonism, the set and logical basis of mathematics instead of the computational basis of mathematics, and everything sort of goes to hell, to the point where we get Einstein and Bohr writing descriptions but not causal relations. So we are still trying to discover those causal relations today in those disciplines, but math has gone off in quirky land as much as physics has. Philosophy's run itself into a dead end. Economics has become the pseudo-theology of the day by combining extraordinary innumeracy with every kind of sophistry and deceit that's possible to foist upon a populace desperate to understand what's going on. So in P-law, we eliminate the dependence on non-contradiction and the law of the exclusive middle, because those are necessary for scale independence and context, and replace them with the law of continuous recursive disambiguation, sufficient to satisfy demand for decidability in the context. Because the physical sciences seek to explain, the legal sciences seek to identify ignorance, error, bias, deceit, and war. We're not trying to justify anything, because we're not trying to organize people toward a good. We're trying to say that you can organize whatever you want. This is the rule of law principle. Do whatever you want as long as it's not false or irreciprocal. So to continue with the method of computation, we've gone through analogy, mythology, and writing, reason, syllogism, and geometry, empiricism, rationalism, and Cartesian mathematics. Cartesianism was really the restoration of mathematical realism. We got, of mathematical empiricism. Mathematical realism sounds like it's scientific, but mathematical realism means the opposite of what it says. It means that there's this real alternate mathematical reality, instead of mathematics just being a language like any other. We had science, calculation, and the calculus. Then we developed computation, the algorithm, and programs. We've been in the phase of systematizing simulations and simulating. In other words, that if you've ever seen The Game of Life, or you've understood fractals, these things are possible only because the ability for us to carry on adversarial computations, permutations, has exceeded human scale's ability to do computation. And then adversarialism is the Bayesian evolution, or adversarial neural networks, which train each other and the producing predictions, or categorizations is actually the right word. Current AI isn't very AI, it just produces categories. You still need programs to learn logic once you've categorized senses. And then the next step should be embodied adversarialism, which is hierarchical recursive Bayesian evolution, or what we think of as thinking. Now, continuous information, logical comparison, state memory, recursive wayfinding, embodied falsification, meaning acting, testing something through action, which falsifies, producing continuous recursive disambiguation. Now that's what happens when you're being human. So continuous recursive disambiguation produces serialized information transfer, what we call speech. So our brain uses continuous information streams to produce logical comparisons, to produce states, and recursive, we think of the episodes, objects, episodes, etc. We use recursive wayfinding, in other words, attention, to find our way through different permutations, and we use embodiment, action, to falsify whether those are possible or not. And then we continue with this continuous recursive cycle, and that's what our brains do every day. Well, at least most of ours. I don't know. Sometimes I'm not sure what's going on up there in myself. So speech, likewise, is the same process of wayfinding. We use continuous recursive disambiguation to transfer information in serial terms. And mathematics, likewise, consists of a trivial vocabulary, a logic of positional names, and a hierarchy of statement sentences that allow increasingly complex descriptions. So there's really no difference. Math is just the dumbest possible language we can produce because of that it's the least open to ignorance, error, bias, and deceit, especially when it's scale independent. But the scope of mathematical calculation is an interesting word, calculation and computation are different, is smaller than the scope of operational computation. That which is constructible is larger than that is what's deducible. The scope of operational computation is smaller than the scope of adversarial simulation. In other words, what you can permute from first principles isn't as broad as what you can compute from an adversarial simulation. And the scope of adversarial simulation is smaller than hierarchical recursive prediction. In other words, producing the ability to outwit someone, which is what thinking does. So these are generations of reasoning, and I'm trying to position us as what we're trying to do with this program is move reasoning out of overcome the failure of us to systematize Babbage in the 1830s and reverse the industrialization of sophistry, pseudoscience, and numeracy, lying, whatever, over the past century and a half, and restore our traditional rates of evolution, progress, and prosperity for all. But I'm trying to put our position in history here as we're working with computation. Now, unfortunately, once we get beyond computation, we're beyond human sense perception. We're beyond intersubjectively verifiable statements. This is the problem with AIs today, or Bayesian learning today, is that you can't introspect upon them any more than you can move your arm, but you can't introspect into your cerebellum to figure out how that incredibly complex thing just happened. And you can't see it. Well, the same thing happens with AIs. And so it doesn't appear so it appears that, I don't want to make that jump. How can I do that? So it appears that this is the maximum level of resolution necessary in law until we develop the next body of science, which is I think is what Nassim Taleb doesn't realize he's been searching for, and he doesn't understand we can't do without a system of measurement, and that system of measurement can only be an artificial intelligence. So but if we look at mathematics applied to economics, for example, that you get an atom, right, and it's a stable relationship that hydrogen isn't going to decay very easily as long as temperatures don't get too cold. Well, it's a stable relation. Well, in economics, there are stable relations or patterns of sustainable production, distribution, and trade out in the economy. And so regardless of what happens, if we had enough information, we could predict what was going to happen in the economy from the effect of those networks instead of what we do today, which is work with aggregates too loose to really tell us much in an actionable time frame. So the point I want to make here is that we're bringing reasoning up to the maximum level that's possible for intersubjective human testifiability. I hope I didn't lose anybody with that. I bet I did. That was... what did I do? Okay, sorry, I accidentally hit the keyboard. I lost my place. Anyway, so that produces, so at the end of the program, I told you about the components. I said that our goal was to produce a set of reforms. And I told you in the earlier video that the Institute has the obligation to create a field of people who are able to work with them. So the program is producing a series of outputs, and these are the outputs we are trying to produce. I'm only one guy. I work extraordinarily hard, but I'm still only one guy. And it's not like I'm solving for something simple. I'm solving for something very difficult, and so it's taking me most of my adult life, or a good chunk of my adult life. So we're producing the archives on the website. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to keep them up because they're the record. They're sort of like my journal. Like if you look at diaries of most thinkers, they do keep journals, right? Or they keep a record of their thoughts. I sort of do that by posting things on the website, and we've been doing it since for 20 years. 2009, no, for about 12 years, and I'm working on the program for about 20 years. So but I'm working hard on this thing since 2009. This has been my sort of primary effort since 2009, and I divide my time between the business and this. I need both to be happy. So the archives on the website, which I am not sure I'm going to keep up there. The older guys really like being able to go back and find things. My opinion is that you can go back and find something, and I've recently reformed it or something, and so I'm not really sure that's really good. There are some introductions on the website. That's a duplication of what we're presenting here. There's the reforms, the suit against the state. I've produced what's called the choice videos describing our situation, the crisis that we're in of the age. Producing these instructional videos. I'm producing the course and courseware that are on top of this. There's a book in progress. It has been forever. I sort of work on all these things at once, and this will be the book on the law. The difference is that I don't go into extraordinary detail here like I do in the book, and there's things I skip over, and so the book has a lot more information in it. And there's the Institute that is hopefully will eventually turn into a college of law and a body of people. So those are our deliverables, and those are the resources we have to work from. My opinion, though, is that if you understand these videos, then you've pretty much got it. So if you want to go from the videos to understanding what's going on to actually going through the coursework and doing the assignments and learning how to do it, that's a different thing. It generally takes folks quite a while to be able to learn how to do this. The scope of the presentation I'm giving, so the videos I'm producing, is just to provide an understanding of the method of analysis, the methodology, the grammars, etc., the ternary logics, the Western civilization, and I'm hoping that at the end of these videos you're familiar with it and you can sort of understand how this all fits together. But to learn how to do it or to live it, which is incredibly empowering, you have no idea. You have to do it, and you have to learn it by doing, and it's like learning anything else. I think, in my opinion, it's like learning to program. It's a little harder than learning to program, but it's like learning to program. And we can, most of what we do in the course is produce homework that does examples, and we work on it together. On average, just to give an idea, it takes people with an education in the hard sciences and the scientific method. They have some knowledge of economics or politics, about 6 months to get their arms around it, and about 3 years to master it. So honestly, it's just like any other formal science. If you wanted to get a law degree, it would be as hard as this. It's the same thing. Now, being that the difference is if you're studying law, they do it by the case method. It's just like if you're studying a business school, they do it by the case method. They throw you a bunch of cases, and they're teaching you by solving the problems. But, however, in law and in business, MBA programs or any others, there isn't a formal structure underneath it like there is in programming. So we have the formal structure like programming. And so this, to some degree, makes it quite a bit easier, and to some degree makes it quite a bit harder. It makes it easier because there is a logic underneath it that you can know you're right. And it makes it a little harder in the sense that what most of us do is we're dependent on our intuitions, and we are completely unconscious of how much we're depending on our intuitions, or that the more empathic we are, the more dependent upon our intuitions we are, and the more difficult it is to make rational or calculated choices rather than intuitionistic choices. In other words, it's harder to finish transitioning from the animal to the human than you'd think. So our goal is that we're not going to cover the formal structure of the law or the application of the law. We're going to cover all the policies. Our goal is to familiarize with the concepts and the methodology so you understand when we're talking about something, even if you don't know how to do the method, it's rock solid. And honestly, this is rock solid, period. So this is an evolutionary leap. It's sort of like to the social sciences of sociology, etc. As Aristotle and Epicurus were to Plato and Socrates, as geometry was to arithmetic, as Darwin was to biology, as Nietzsche was to aesthetics. It's a big evolutionary leap in modernizing our thought. It completes the failed revolution in the behavioral sciences. It completes the Anglo-Italian restoration of classical and European thought. And in particular, it ends the revolt against, you probably don't think of it this way, but the post-war era is a revolt against Darwin at every single aspect of it. And because Darwin provided an unpleasant explanation for the disproportionate rate of evolution of Western civilization in the Bronze, Iron, and Steel Ages. And so the truth is sometimes unpleasant. Darwin is unpleasant, but Darwin was not anywhere near as unpleasant as Darwin applied would be. So P-Law combines multiple fields, but to most it will appear as the combination of math, logic, and programmatic logic, cognitive science, economics, and law, and we will use those combinations to restate the linguistic, cognitive, psychological, sociological, political, economic, and group evolutionary strategies of all the civilizations of the world. So these presentations are a subset of the courseware. I think I'm repeating myself here. I'm repeating myself. So you have some idiosyncrasies. I'm idiosyncratic. How do I get away from it? I don't think I can rescue myself from that hole. But you will notice some important idiosyncrasies that I've picked up, especially from Karl Popper. Popper and Hayek were instrumental in treating knowledge as a capital asset and understanding the importance of general knowledge in economy and society. So I picked up a few ideas. One is that I use a lot of font stuff to assist us in scanning. So I like to be able to use highlight or color keywords, or use italics or bold or capital letters. I like to do that so when you're trying to find something you can't remember how to put into words, you can scan for it and find it quickly. I also like it because when you look at a slide, it can jolt your memory and bring you back to what it is. So this helps us in scanning. Otherwise, the text is really what I work on, is because these are detailed arguments, so that's just walls of text. And without them, you don't get a visual pattern, and that visual pattern helps you disambiguate them. The second thing I do that annoys a lot of people is I use German capitalization, which is capitalizing lots of names of ideas. And I do that so that you know what to look up. I'm like, I'm going to capitalize something so it might mean something different from what you think. So I'm using a definition that you might want to refer to. I use a lot of isms. An ism is the name of a paradigm that allows you to produce a set of constant relations from which to use in decision, in understanding, advocating or deciding or even discussing some subject matter. I use a lot of isms because that's what we do. I mean, when we're taking a bundle of ideas, when we're putting it into a package, then the package is somewhat related. So, for example, I might use Marxism, but in the broad sense, because I mean that as a shorthand for a series of the pre- and post-war pseudoscientific revolutions. So I'm going to bundle, I'm just using Marxism as the label for Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-family, anti-male feminism, the PC woke movement, the anti-white, and the movements. So I'm using that as the bucket because the origin is originally the Marxist revolt against Darwin. And when I different definitions of terms, every discipline's got to use specific terms. Like, so a discipline will invent a term to disambiguate it from meaning in another discipline. And so every discipline has to do this. So in order to prevent those errors of deduction or inference or whatever, or specifically to disambiguate something from colloquial use, I use terms with very specific meaning. So you'll see me use these terms over and over again, and you'll say, well, why all these words? I get this common thing. Why this word salad? Because we're creating measurements, we're not creating analogies. And there's a difference between a measurement and an analogy. And when I'm using terms, I'm trying to make measurements. So this is why this speech sounds funny, and why it's like any other discipline and any other language. So just like there are formal terms in physics and in law today. Well, if I'm talking about natural law that's strictly constructed using vocabularies, phrases, sentences, narratives, and arguments, and that are strictly constructed from first principles, it's going to sound like discipline-based language, because it is. Some cases where terms don't exist or they're really abused, I have to create new ones or I have to redefine them. That happens all the time. And then a lot of times, as you see, I have to disambiguate the words. So if something's part of the P, I'm distinguishing P logic from logic. So that's what I'm talking about, P law from law or the P method from the scientific method. I'm doing that so that we can distinguish. We don't get caught up in too many conflationary situations. And then I repeat series all the time: manners, ethics, morals, group strategy, or criminal, unethical, moral, or whatever. I mean, I go through series all the time, and part of that is to prevent prevent ambiguity when you're listening to me, preventing you from making errors. Another is just to repeat stuff often enough so in the process of me repeating it, you learn the series. The origins of the method. I'm on the low end of the spectrum, and so people on the spectrum tend to identify patterns very easily, and we tend to be extraordinarily sensitive to what we consider error, bias, and deceit. And so I have this particular talent, if you want to call it a curse, and so I recognize patterns even if I don't want to. And to some degree, this is. It's sort of like if you imagine OCD, some people need to wash their hands or something. The way it works for autistics is that we are extremely uncomfortable with things that don't make sense. And you'll see this with severe autistics. They will get angry at people like, I'm basically on the extreme lowest end of the spectrum. And so I just have the ability or curse of seeing patterns. When the Democratic Party started shifting from under the Clintons to using the Alinsky method full time, and that was to use talking points, and the conservatives couldn't respond, I thought I'd come up with a language to help them talk. I was annoyed by the fact that conservatives or Europeans or libertarians can make their ideas, but they're bullshit. That's overstating it. Libertarians' ideas are half true. Conservatives can't even say what's true, and they're the ones that are right. So I'm innately classical liberal like Jefferson, so I'm very Jeffersonian. So I would say that I wanted to create this value-neutral language so that people could talk, and it didn't bother me that they were failing to talk. And I came to understand that this was a problem with our law, and by accident, I produced a logic of the sciences. And no one would set out to do this on purpose. You'd have to be crazy. You could certainly never get it through a dissertation committee. I could never do it in the academy. They'd never let me work for 15 years on something. So I became an entrepreneur, and I funded myself. Funded my own research program, and this is where we are. The end result is the completion of the 5,000-year European rule of law program, bringing the Europeans, the Aristotelians, and Epicureans back into complete cycle. And I think that I've brought it down to where we're now. Our knowledge of the world is back in harmony with our understanding of our origins and why our origins managed to succeed. Mostly I was in, this is for people who are interested in philosophy, these things. I'm heavily influenced by Hayek. I consider myself completing the Hayekian project. If I didn't do it on purpose, but if I look back historically, I followed the same process he did, which was I went through artificial intelligence, and he went through the sensory order. I went through economics, he went through economics, he went through law, and I went through law. And the only difference between Hayek and I is I have the privilege to be part of the computer generation that transferred it saw the transformation, and it was that seeing and living through the transformation, being a little younger than Hayek, or a little coming around a little later than he did, that probably made the difference, because in my world, he had discovered it. He just couldn't bring it across the line because the knowledge wasn't there for the reasons that I stated earlier. So basically, I see my work as an accident of trying to solve a problem that was real, and in retrospect, I can see who has tried to solve this problem in history. But anyways, it's sort of easy to synthesize information for people with or across scientific disciplines. It's relatively difficult to educate people in those differences and then demonstrate commensurability, consistency, and coherence across them. This is why the reasons P, logic, science, and law is somewhat difficult for most people, because to know why it works is more difficult. Even if using it is like diagramming sentences and writing software. In other words, you have to understand why it works. So, and this is what I'm trying to get across, in order to be able to trust in what it produces. So I'm pretty much fluent in every discipline other than chemistry. My grandfather's specialty was chemistry. I don't know. I think I went through chemistry class and I just found it really dirty, and it evoked my disgust response. All this washing of tubes and stuff. I don't know. I didn't like it. So I tend to avoid chemistry. Fluency in mathematics are sometimes helpful, but they're also sometimes a hindrance, because they use this archaic vocabulary and set logic, and unlearning those mistakes is pretty difficult. Programming is as big an improvement in the logics, including math, as calculus was in mathematics, marginalism in economics, and evolution in biology. It's a different kind of thinking, and if you learn how to program and you go back, you almost can't imagine that the people before programming, how they thought about math. It's almost like it's a language. It's almost like it's magic. And so that's what's gone wrong, is we haven't applied the innovation of programming widely enough yet, although the present 30s generation of AI researchers seems to be getting there. I mean, I think of Joshua Bach, who's the other person I know I think gets it. He certainly does, and he's still a little poetic, and he's a little German leftist and poetic, or soft leftist and poetic, and I'm a little Anglo conservative libertarian and analytic, but he definitely understands it. It's really not that hard, though. You should think about it, learning to diagram sentences, learning to program. You don't have to speak in it. It's like many other things. The hard part is that you need to develop, in most cases, you need to develop an intuition for math and programming. In our case, you have to unlearn the intuition of appealing to intuition to make decisions about the world, especially social science decisions, because that's so loud, an instinct. The vocabulary is smaller than it appears. It takes high IQ people quite a bit of time, so don't be disturbed if it takes a little bit to know it, but the benefit you get from the findings of it, even if you never reach the point where you can write law, it'll be amazing to you how your mind transfers, how everything in the world will all of a sudden be coherent, make sense. You'll understand why things happened, why they happen now. You'll understand what's going on because pieces of the world will fit together. So it's sort of like, just as we had the scientific revolution that made us understand the physical world, this is the cognitive science and psychological and social science revolution completed, brought into empiricism and uniting the physical and the hard and soft sciences. And it'll surprise you. What you'll find out is most of us are bots. It's terrible, running on very simple operating system, on a terribly simple operating system, a very buggy software with a really complex user interface. All of us think at, and your first reaction will have, which is mine. Well, of course, I'm a Jeffersonian classical liberal, and your reaction will have to be greater empathy for those who are running buggy software. I mean, I used to think people were evil. I really did, and when I was young, I thought people were evil. As I got older and worked through this, I realized that they're just doing the best they can because they've got really bad software. And so if you're lucky, you'll discover how to achieve what I think of as consciousness. So was achieve in the psychological, social sphere, the human sphere, what we've achieved in the physical sciences. You'll understand that sphere as well as the other one. And the challenge is caused by the feels versus reals. The feels side of the spectrum must feel it before they can understand it. I understand it's harder for you. And the real side of the spectrum must understand it before they can feel it. That's what people like me do. We don't feel first, we think first. And once we understand something, we can maybe feel it. It's a journey for both sides of the spectrum. But that said, knowledge isn't change, it's just the potential for it. No parasite's ever been convinced to give up parasitism. No criminal who's ever stopped practicing his crime until it was outlawed and he was under threat of it. So some criminal organizations evolve into institutions, and some institutions evolve into criminal organizations. And the argument is that any and all institutions of scale will eventually turn into criminal organizations in one way or the other. So while much scientific falsification of ignorance, error, bias, deceit, fraud, and organized crime is always met with resistance, the greatest resistance we meet is from people, groups, classes, cultures, and indeed entire civilizations that operate as organized crime societies. Someone said it has the effect of being so intellectually inaccessible and dense. Initially discourages you from trying, and then when you learn it, you perceive it as almost too simple to believe. Yet you still understand it's complex. That's my experience. I think this is probably true. I mean, once you get it, It's like anything else. But I think the difference is the physical world is less tangible to you, providing you benefits, than the social and political world is providing you benefits. And I think that P-Law actually will help you a great deal. Anyway, that's my hope anyway, and I think that most people who've learned it would agree. Anyway, my name is Kurt Doolittle. This is the Proprietarianism Institute. This is my overview of the entire program, its background, and what we're trying to achieve. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. It was way longer than I wanted. Anyway, I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much for watching. Please stick with us.